What if your past does not have to define you, but your body still keeps the score? That, to me, is the real tension at the heart of The Courage to be Disliked. This book opens up as a dialogue-driven introduction to Adlerian psychology that pushes back against Freudian determinism. Freud often explains our suffering through childhood wounds, unconscious drives, and the enduring grip of the past. Freudian deterministic frameworks feel intuitively compelling because they reduce shame. If my pain has a cause, then that doesn't mean that I'm simply weak. That's the explanation we all like to fall for. Adler, on the other hand, tells us we are not shaped by our past. He tells us we are not trapped, not by our childhood, not by our wounds, and not by the stories we keep telling ourselves. He is less interested in what caused you to become this way, and more interested in what purpose your present way of living is serving. In that sense, Adler restores agency. He tells us that our past doesn't have to dictate who we are, and that is exactly where both his power and the danger of his philosophy begin. Because instead of saying we can overcome the pain of the past, he denies the influence of the past on our present entirely. One of the most controversial takes in the book is his denial of trauma, and we will come back to this. What I appreciate the most about Adlerian psychology is its emphasis on making the best use of the gifts and talents that you're provided, rather than dwelling on the things that you lack. You can waste so much of life staring at what you lack and the advantages that never came your way. This would always make you feel disadvantaged. If you think of life as a game of cards, Adler suggests for you to shift the frame, going from thinking, why was I not dealt better cards, to what will I do with the hand I have? Your friend may have a joker, and you may only have a 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and still you can win the hand. If you take all day complaining over why you didn't have that joker, even if someone handed you the joker, your mind would simply find a new reason to feel deprived. Adler's first idea centers on purpose rather than cause, or what he calls teleology over causation. Consider a mother in the middle of a heated argument with her daughter. Her voice is sharp, emotionally charged, almost explosive. Then the phone rings. At first, there's still a trace of irritation, but the moment she realizes she's speaking to the child's teacher, she becomes very polite. And just like all the Asian tiger moms out there, the moment she hangs up, she's going to go back directly, yelling at her daughter. The main takeaway is that her ability to instantly switch between those emotional states tells us she's not simply possessed by anger. There's some level of self-control left. So part of that anger was trying to serve a purpose. Where Freud might ask what earlier wound this anger expresses, Adler asks what purpose this anger is serving now, and he makes this point even more explicit in the following quote. Irascible people do not have short tempers. It is only that they do not know that there are effective communication tools other than anger. Of course, not every emotional outburst is calculated. Some of them can be signs of genuine dysregulation, which need to be handled with care, but we can still take Adler's point to the extent to imply a suggestion for us to reflect on how often our emotions are being used as a means to accomplish something. Another Adlerian idea I find deeply useful is his concept of worldviews and self-labels, which is around this whole pattern through which a person sees the world and themselves. And what I like here is Adler's refusal to freeze identity into labels. If someone says, my personality is pessimistic, Adler might reframe that as, I hold a pessimistic worldview. That kind of tiny switch can shift you away from that fixed mindset of thinking your personality is what you're born with. When you shift to the word worldview, it just sounds a lot more advisable. There can be other labels that you put on yourself, including I'm shy, or that I'm bad with people, or I'm just an introvert, this is simply who I am. We speak these things as descriptions, then slowly they become permissions not to change. And people might also cling to the self they know out of a fear for uncertainty. If you chose to adopt a new way of thinking or living, you don't know the kind of self that will emerge, nor how you would handle what lies ahead. The future becomes unpredictable and life fills with anxiety. So even if people are dissatisfied, they often cling to the present because it feels easier and safer. That's why change also requires courage. If I had to choose one concept from the book that is most practical, it would be this one, the separation of tasks. Adler locates most human misery in the failure to distinguish what is yours to carry and what is not. He gives this example of choosing to trust someone. To trust someone is your task, but how they handle or treat your trust is theirs. And the same goes for giving. The act of giving is up to you. Whether the other person chooses to reciprocate is up to them. In summary, we should just discard other people's tasks. This means you are going to have to disappoint some people, including your parents. In the Asian context, there is often this unspoken expectation that being a good child means remaining constantly available, calling often, visiting often, and reassuring your parents through your presence. Of course, there's a lot of love in that, but there can also be emotional overreach. Because at some point you're gonna have to ask, is it really my task to manage my parents' happiness? I can love them, respect them, and make time for them when I can, but if their deeper emotional stability rests entirely on my availability, that cannot be my burden alone. This is not just being a cold-hearted person, it's the hard-won clarity that you cannot live someone else's life for them, nor should they live yours.
And I think one reason people care so much about approval is precisely because they do not separate tasks. They see other people's disappointment as their responsibility.
If your mom is disappointed that you dropped out of med school to start this new business that she doesn't understand and support, then just let her be sad for 2 months for her to learn that she cannot impose expectations on you. Allow them to be sad for 2 months, even 2 years.
It's fine. They're adults.
One of the ways you can make it easier to be free of seeking approval is by recognizing that you are not the center of everyone's attention. A lot of our anxiety comes from taking ourselves too seriously, from imagining that our mistakes, awkwardness, or failures linger in other people's minds far longer than they actually do. We create these elaborate inner dramas. Oh, I said the wrong thing, I forgot something, or I looked foolish, I disappointed someone. And yes, maybe it bothered them for a moment, then they moved on, because they're also living inside their own worries, their own self-consciousness, and incomplete businesses. This is part of what Adler means by the courage to be ordinary. Not that you're worthless, not that you should think less of yourself, but that once you stop needing to be exceptional in other people's eyes, a lot of your fears just starts to fade away. At one point, Adler references a Jewish teaching. Out of 10 people, there will be one person who is the critic that criticizes you for everything you do. 2 people will deeply support you, and the rest, 7 people, are just neutral. Adler's interpretation here is that for people who lack harmony in life, they tend to just fixate on that one person, the critic, and to mistake that fragment for the whole world. And that, I think, is exactly why the fear of disapproval can become so disproportionate. We build our lives around avoiding the judgment of a tiny minority, and in doing so, hand over far too much power to other people's opinions. That's why I often return to a Stoic idea from Epictetus: if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Growth doesn't just require effort, it often requires a willingness or courage to be misunderstood. That's why growth and comfort rarely coexist. If I stop the video here, you'd probably think, holy shit, Adlerian psychology is incredibly compelling. Adler is starting to sound all-encompassing, but I do not think he is. Throughout the book, he's made a lot of examples that I don't necessarily agree with, especially in passages like this. My father was a moody, taciturn person, but to think to myself, he hit me that time, and that is why our relationship went bad, is a Freudian etiological way of thinking. The Adlerian teleology position completely reverses the cause and effect interpretation. That is to say, I brought out the memory of being hit because I don't want my relationship with my father to get better. I appreciate what Adler is trying to do here, which is to help us restore agency by questioning the motive behind that memory. And I wouldn't just blast at this paragraph entirely, because there is some level of psychological research around the malleability of memory supporting this, from psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, where she describes memory as a Wikipedia page, how you can go back and edit it, but so can others. Hence, memory is, for the large part, fallible. There is some level of truth in that, but that does not erase the reality that people have been genuinely hurt, and that some forms of suffering are not merely narrative conveniences. He mentioned this other example that when a person who wants to leave a relationship, they will begin assembling reasons around that goal. But it does not follow that those reasons are empty. The goal may sharpen the narrative without inventing the pain. The strongest criticism of Adlerian psychology has always been his denial of trauma. Adler can sound as though suffering persists because a person has not yet chosen courage. That framing can be empowering and liberating in some cases, but deeply invalidating in others. A philosophy designed to restore agency can be weaponized into a rhetoric of blame. When you universalize Adlerian thinking, it can minimize trauma and oversimplify mental illness. I think it can be really easy to preach resilience when you have yet to meet with the kind of pain that literally reorganizes someone's nervous system. We like to look back and say, oh, I was able to go through that because I was resilient, when maybe you were just lucky to be blessed with an upbringing that never tested your resilience. I just want to share one quote from Nietzsche. He says, "No one can construct for you the bridge upon which precisely you must cross the stream of life." And that's right, no one can live for you. Nietzsche tells us that there's responsibility, but he doesn't deny the difficulty. Trauma can explain why the bridge is harder to cross, but it doesn't eliminate the fact that eventually you still have to cross it. But obviously, not all suffering is dysfunction. Dostoevsky reminds us of a different truth. Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. Sometimes the suffering isn't a sign that something's wrong with you. Sometimes it's just a prerequisite to feel things so very deeply, or to carry more depth in your consciousness than is comfortable. In the Tang Dynasty, poet Du Fu, writing in exile about his friend Li Bai, captures the same tragic recognition. In Chinese, the original statement says, 文章赠命的，魑魅袭人过. And just please forgive my horrible translation and the slight inaccuracy, but the gist of it is that literary brilliance is often accompanied by a troubled fate, while dark forces delight in a good person's misstep. If you want to be great, you have to suffer. The goal is not to eliminate suffering. And I don't think The Courage to be Disliked or the entire Adlerian psychology aims to make you happy. I think their aim is to reduce suffering that is meaningless and self-defeating. That's why I appreciate the framework Adler has set up for people to understand that, yeah, you can understand your suffering and I will attend to my responsibilities. Each of us will have to take some level of responsibility for what becomes of our misfortune. This book is still worth our time because Adler gives us a language for courage. He sets up this entire framework for setting up boundaries and then categorizing your responsibilities, as well as the central idea of just refusing to turn your wounds into destiny. That, I think, if you give it a read, will definitely make your life a lot better.